Hello, 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 everyone. Thank you and welcome. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Risk-Based Security Sessions, Secure the Vote, Hacktivism and Vulnerabilities in U.S. Elections. My name is Inga Goddijn and I will be the session host for today. I'm joined by a couple of my colleagues and we are very excited to be with you. And we're really looking forward to sharing our observations about election security. Quite the timely topic. Before we get rolling today, I have a couple of housekeeping notes for us all. First and foremost, this session will be recorded and made available on Bright Talk and on the Risk-Based Security website. So please do bookmark this link and share it with your friends and your colleagues who might be interested and find it useful. Today's session is a part of a series of sessions highlighting the work of our data breach and vulnerability research teams. I'm sure you don't want to miss out on future sessions, so please do take a moment to subscribe to the Risk-Based Security channel on Bright Talk. You'll be rewarded with future insights into our research. With that, we also would like to hear from you during our sessions. Your questions are welcome, so please feel free to post those in the question box that's provided on the platform. We'll address some of those questions as we go along, and we will pause at the end for a Q&A. So please feel free to put your questions out there. Do remember, though, that the questions are anonymous, so if you want us to acknowledge you by name, please do include your name in the question. If you are watching on replay, or need to get in touch with us for any other reason, you can do so via the contact page on our website, riskbasedsecurity.com. So with that, let's get rolling. All right, as I said, my name is Inga Goddijn. I head up the data breach research team here at Risk-Based Security, where every year we aggregate data on thousands of data breach events, literally thousands of events every year. And we catalog information ranging from how the breach happened to the economic fallout after the fact. I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, Roy Bass, Threat Intelligence Researcher, and Brian Martin, Vice President of Vulnerability Intelligence. Now, Roy has been working in the intelligence gathering space for about 3 years. He specializes in analyzing data from the deep and dark web sources that we follow, with a specific focus on data breach activity and threat actor research. Roy, would you like to say hello?
Hi, everyone. My name is Roy Bass, as Inga has said, and I'm excited to discuss the dark web and how it relates to hacktivism.
All right. Thank you, thank you. Also joining us is Brian Martin, Vice President of Vulnerability Intelligence. Brian has been studying, collecting, and cataloging vulnerabilities like a squirrel with nuts since 1993, both personally and professionally. Brian has been the content manager of the Open Source Vulnerability Database, or the OSVDB, and has been pushing for the evolution of vulnerability databases for many, many years. Brian has been involved in all aspects of vulnerability disclosure, ranging from finding new vulnerabilities, through coordinating disclosure, which is no small feat, and making contributions to major vendor security and bug bounty programs. Brian, would you like to say hello?
Hello, everyone. Thank you. And I'll be speaking a little later on electronic voting machines.
Yes, that is, yeah, a few scary things to cover today, and that being one of them. And speaking of things that we are going to cover today, just a quick agenda to share with everyone. Certainly, I don't think it will come as a surprise to anyone that there has just been an absolute deluge of news these past few months around election security and possible interference in the election process. So much news, in fact, that we're seeing a wide range of very, very different security-related issues being lumped together under the banner of election security. And if you could see me, I'm doing air quotes on that election security. We're seeing everything from straight up voter fraud to outright tampering with the ballots, all being melded and mushed together under this notion of are our elections secure. So our goal for today is to sort through some of that noise and share our perspective on the election threat landscape as we see it. And that means in particular that we want to take a look at those areas we know best, and that would be hacking activity and software vulnerabilities. So to that end, we're going to get the conversation going by sharing our take on some of the terminology that's being used to describe threats to our election. And we want to start that at that point because we feel like that way we can all be on the same page as to exactly what we are and exactly what we are not talking about as we move through our discussion of hacking and hacktivism and the type of recent activity that we're seeing out there in this space. From there, we're going to take the conversation even deeper, as Brian said, and spend time examining just how vulnerable our election technology might be and dig into whether or not it really is possible to compromise electronic voting machines and actually manipulate ballots. So that's going to be fun. It's all going to be fun. But with that, so, we were talking about, our topics here today, and we were talking about all those different things that are being lumped under election security. And we came up with the question, so what exactly do you call it when a random person tweets a link to an alleged stolen voter database? I'm not exactly sure what sort of label should be slapped on that. But as I said at the outset, we do know that a lot of different types of malicious activity is being lumped under the label of political interference or tampering with the election. Now, a lot of the media focus right now is on the spread of misinformation or disinformation, and understandably so. But we do want to say, for the record, misinformation and disinformation are actually two different things. Misinformation is false information that's spread around regardless of intent to mislead. It's a pretty common occurrence, and certainly anybody who's spent more than 5 minutes on Facebook or Twitter recently is familiar with how quickly inflammatory stories and outright dubious news get spread around through social networks. Misinformation, I like to think of it as just a good old-fashioned rumor mill, but really kicked up into high gear given our technology and the ability to share information these days. Disinformation, on the other hand, is the spread of deliberately misleading or deceptive information. So really the big core difference between the two terms, mis and disinformation, is the intent of the person who's spreading it around, right? So disinformation, you intend to spread inaccurate or misleading information. You intend to deceive. And disinformation at scale, it tends to come from those organized campaigns with a clear goal of spreading false or inaccurate information. Being a little bit of an older person, I was taught that this is called propaganda, but now we like to refer to it as disinformation in the cyber age. And certainly while focusing in on the mechanics of how this bad information can be spread around makes for a really interesting study and can be a whole webinar in and of itself, what we really want to focus in at the outset here is how hackers, or even hacktivism in general, can be used as a political or an ideological weapon, and how that activity can actually morph into disinformation and the ultimate goal of spreading around that disinformation. So with that said, when I think of a hacker or a malicious attacker, I think of someone or a group of someone's out there seeking to exploit a technical weakness in order to compromise a network or system. And when I think of a hacktivist, I also think of someone or a group of someone's out there seeking to exploit a technical weakness in order to compromise a network or system, which really is pretty much the exact same definition. So where do we start with unpacking all of this? Well, I'd like to start with what I think is a fun question for Roy, and ask Roy, from your perspective, looking at the activity that you see out there today on the deep and dark web, do you really see a difference between the hacker and the hacktivist?
Yeah, well, to be honest, that is a great and significant question. I would say the biggest difference is definitely in their motivation. Hackers are generally motivated by some monetary goal or at times notoriety. We see most hackers target user and financial data in intent to sell, ransom, or abuse it. And really any vulnerable business or person is considered fair game. But hacktivists are motivated by achieving some political action or goal. So because of the difference in motivation, we can see a clear difference in their targeting, ideology, and loyalty. So the tools or techniques can be the same, but hacktivists would focus on infrastructure takedowns or website defacements that can pressure government or protesters and maybe not cause any direct gains to the hacker. So naturally, we see a spike in hacktivism for a short time during periods of conflicts or tension. But some hacktivism is consistently around, like environmental hacktivists who target these big corporations. And really, there are a limited number of skilled threat actors or hackers in the world. So we do see some, so to speak, normal hackers become hacktivists, either because it's a cause they care for and are affected by, or it might just be a market opportunity for some of these people.
That's interesting. So there can be the same people, just different motivations at play there. So when you think about that, and you think about who can go into some of these different categories of different type of people, how do you tell the difference between these different types of hacktivists?
Yeah, so it's probably easiest to break it down into three main categories. So first, definitely the most well-known or discussed is the state-sponsored threat actors. China, North Korea, Iran. These are the hackers funded by or maybe directly part of a government, and they usually have nearly unlimited resources and highly skilled hackers. They're acting under government orders or state-sanctioned operations. And the second, not to be confused with group, is patriotic hackers. So these are groups or individuals who are nationalistic and attempt to either partake in government objectives or target perceived enemies of the state. So a great example of kind of where we could see the difference is when Russia invaded Crimea in Ukraine. There were reports of infrastructure targeting that coordinated with Russian soldier movements, signaling state-sponsored actors, but also at the same time general cyber attacks against Ukrainian citizens or businesses, which are much more consistent with patriotic hackers kind of attempting to join the fight. And finally, the third group, what's left is we have these individuals or groups who seem to be politically motivated by cause. So Catalonians start to protest against the Spanish government, and then we see a lot of people taking credit for defacing Spanish businesses, the Spanish websites with pro-protester slogans. These people aren't nationalistic per se, but more so maybe linked to an ideology like anti-government.
Okay. I'm with you now. And I think I might have gotten a little bit ahead of you, but I'm with you now. Well, that is, I think, that's an interesting point, that really the difference between like a hacker and a hacktivist can kind of flow back and forth. We're really taking a look at their motivation. And I do think it's interesting that some of these hackers can trade off on the hacktivist type of label. And I think we saw that in our election last year with Guccifer 2.0 passing themselves off as being a hacktivist, but was had links back to the Russian military intelligence unit. And it's a good example, I think, of how a state-sponsored actor can present themselves as an independent hacktivist voice. But with all these different voices out there, these different folks, treating themselves, presenting themselves as being a patriot, or being just a politically motivated individual, or maybe having larger goals behind them. So how do you see them being different, like in the amount of chatter or the amount of talk, or how they present themselves through the various forums in order to help tell the difference between these different types of groups?
Yeah, so sometimes it is quite difficult, and kind of like you mentioned, sometimes threat actors don't want people to know where they're really from or who they're really supporting. You know, there's kind of an advantage to maybe kind of shielding if you're a state-sponsored actor versus an independent hacktivist, like you just said. So sometimes it's hard to tell, but really you can usually tell by their targeting and their methods. So state-sponsored hackers, with their kind of unlimited resources and state-sanctioned plans, they can go for places like military bases, high-level politicians, critical infrastructure like at an airport, these kind of much more difficult places to breach, much more difficult places to breach, but they have the resources, the time for it, and their goal would be maybe to steal confidential information. And patriotic hackers or individuals, they'd likely target soft targets like business websites, private citizens, and they would be more likely to partake in defacement, harassment, or direct threats to kind of help push their goal, whatever their political goal is. So you really do see a difference there, that the state-sponsored threat actors go for these much more difficult targets, and then patriotic hackers and individuals might go for soft targets, and they're usually trying to create a greater sense of pressure on a government or corporation or really increase media attention towards the cause.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So, you know, the funding behind the person conducting or the group conducting the operation gives them a little more leeway to go after a much harder target. So that makes sense. That makes sense. So now we know something about the folks out there. We know something about their motivations. Let's talk a little bit more in detail about what sort of recent hacktivism or hacking activity has been observed out there. I know with everything that's going on in the world right now, I know you're seeing a lot of activity. So can you tell us more about some of the recent campaigns that you've observed?
Yeah, definitely. As we kind of mentioned before, we see hacktivism spikes during times of conflict or protest, which unfortunately it seems like there's been plenty of recently, or at least in the past year. One great example is the recent contested elections in Belarus. After the Russian-friendly and longtime President Lukashenko claimed victory in Belarus, there were massive protests against him and against the election. At that time, we started seeing a lot of Belarusian data on the dark web being requested, trade, or sold on Russian-speaking forums particularly. Databases like individuals who are serving administrative leave for partaking in a protest, or individuals who were arrested in the first week of protest. So a lot of these databases contained names, addresses, phone numbers, and maybe even criminal records or political affiliations. So this information could be used for intimidation purposes, harassment, or even reconnaissance. And it certainly applies an interest from regime-friendly hacktivists. And as the protests continued in Belarus, as the protests kind of declined over the summer to fall, we definitely saw a decline in the data leaks as well. So the height of the leaks occurred directly with the height of the protests. But we do see kind of things, not only with protests, but traditional state versus state wars and conflicts as well.
Wow. I can't imagine what it would feel like to be the person in that position where, because you're speaking your mind and you're advocating for a point of view and protesting for a free and fair election, but the result of that is your personal information being put out there to be leveraged by your opponent. That is a frightening type of data breach for sure. But the Belarus is not the only activity that's going on right now. I know we just recently had new military action crop up in Armenia and Azerbaijan. Are you seeing activity around that?
Yeah, so that is much more recent, and we did see a lot of similar data on people from Azerbaijan being circulated on Russian-speaking forums specifically. But in some ways, this conflict is an even better example of hacktivism. Here we saw a group aptly named the Azerbaijan Cyber Army. first hacking the Armenian government websites and defacing them with pro-Azerbaijan slogans, but then also continuing to obtain and dumping a database of 1 million Armenian citizens and their passport information. So we've not independently verified the data ourselves, but it's been reported that the data actually contained the Armenian Prime Minister's real passport information, which can be quite damaging. So that's pretty significant cyber strike or significant hacktivism. And then from the Armenian side, on the opposing side, there was a database stolen and circulated on the dark web that allegedly contained classified information from the Azerbaijan Navy. And patriotic hackers were also reportedly targeting Azerbaijani citizens specifically and their routers and kind of messing with their internet settings. So for both sides, it seems like patriotic hackers trying to cause havoc or pressure on the governments, but also moving beyond databases on individuals. And it's also interesting because you wouldn't really see hackers going for random citizens and messing with their DNS settings to mess with their internet settings because it likely wouldn't provide any gain for them. But you do see a lot of this type of activity during hacktivism because it can progress their political goal.
Yeah, interesting. So I know you and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, but you know, there's just a limited number of folks out there that have the skills to and the motivation to pull off or to engage in this kind of activity. And you know, when I think about Belarus and ties to Russia, and then the nature of the Azeri-Armenia conflict, I'm wondering, when you look at that activity across the forums and out there, do you see differences in like the duration of these campaigns or the amount of data being released, or what do you see in that area?
Yeah, I would say we definitely see a striking difference in both methods and really the asymmetry. So we don't see a lot of hacktivism against the Belarusian government as opposed to against the protesters. And that is likely due to the power and capability difference there. And we also have a big power player like Russia who has a clear interest with the Belarusian government, but no clear favor in the Azerbaijan conflict. So in that conflict, there's more of a traditional state versus state warfare scenario with hacktivism occurring to a large degree on both sides. It's definitely easier to target an entire country or people like in the Azerbaijan versus Armenia case, as opposed to other hacktivism scenarios we've seen where groups or countries might be trying to protect a sensitive political situation, like an election from hacktivists. But the difference is definitely in the asymmetry and the power imbalance.
Delightful, delightful. And if all of that is going on overseas, I'm sure the chatter around our election next week here in the States is going to be absolutely off the chart. So let's dig into that a little bit more. Can you tell us about what you're seeing around hacktivism regarding the American election?
Yeah, definitely. Exactly like we were saying before, if anytime there's political conflicts, anytime there's times of heightened tensions, or even elections, you know, we expect to see some form of hacktivism, and that's definitely been the case here. So as we have had the election rapidly approaching, it's crazy to think that's only a week away, but we've seen a growing interest in American voter databases. So a lot of threat actors on hacker forums requesting, circulating, or selling information on voters, particularly in swing states like Florida and Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio, which is even more concerning. And they might not come from breached sources either. A lot of the voter information can come from older databases or even public sources, but it is certainly concerning to see hackers on the dark web taking a greater interest in the data. The type of data that people seem to be looking for specifically contains personal information like names and addresses, and contact information like phone numbers and email addresses. And what's even more requested or valuable and being sold around are these databases that were breached from organizations surrounding the American political infrastructure. So companies that partake in, let's say, political marketing, intelligence, or helping out with the campaigns, they hold this very rich data that typically contains political affiliation or someone who has voted for in the past. And as we could imagine, this could be very, very useful for hacktivists who are looking to target particular voters and maybe influence an election, or just the way that the election is perceived as fair.
Yeah. I do think it's worth sharing with the audience that the FBI did come out with a statement a couple of weeks ago that some of those databases that were being circulated were not evidenced to have come from an actual compromise of voter data held by a local, governmental entity. So probably either recycled data or data gathered from public sources. But that said, there were just 2 counties late last week who did have their networks compromised. One in California, one in Indiana. So definitely an evolving space for sure. And what do you see as being the ultimate goals for these actors right now?
I would say really the ultimate goal with most of the observed activity is to kind of create a sense of mistrust. It's more so an attack on the institution than specific candidates or voters themselves. So there's certainly hacktivists or state-sponsored hacktivist threat actors that have a preference for a candidate or a political party, but really whether it's creating doubt in the fairness and validity of the election or voter intimidation, the end game seems to be to enhance frustration, havoc, or mistrust in the process and the outcome. And as we could imagine, successful weakening of American institutions, could therefore weaken America's perceived integrity or political standing in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Getting back to that, spread more disinformation in order to create that uncertainty, for sure. I do want to chime in for a moment because I do think it's interesting that it's really, we share that opinion, Roy and I share that opinion, but it's actually just not our opinion. In fact, last week we saw a couple of announcements from multiple federal agencies coming out, even after we had already started our slides, just confirming that the goal of these hackers/hacktivists is really to spread distrust in the outcome of the election. And in fact, just last Wednesday, just last week, the Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, acknowledged that voter registration data had been targeted, presumably in an attempt to communicate false information to voters, and in his words, in the hopes of causing confusion, sowing chaos, and undermining confidence in the American democracy. So we do have leading federal officials concurring that looks like the goal of these actors. And then his statements were actually followed right after that, 24 hours later on Thursday, by a joint press release from the FBI and CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, that provided technical details and indicators of compromise linked to a specific state-sponsored actor that is actively targeting governmental networks. Now, their release pretty much echoed the words, or the sentiment at least, of Mr. Ratcliffe, saying, to date, the FBI and CISA have no information to indicate this APT actor has intentionally disrupted any aviation, education, elections, or government operations. However, the actor may be seeking to obtain access for future disruption options. So again, sowing that mistrust, future disruption, to influence U.S. policies and actions, or delegitimize state, local, territorial, and tribal governmental entities. So pretty much right on message about a lot of this activity that we're seeing around the U.S. election really being targeted towards creating that uncertainty and doubt in the outcome. I will say, though, where the two statements diverged somewhat was on exactly how secure the vote might actually be. Now, Mr. Ratcliffe was emphatic with his words, saying that our election systems are resilient and you can be confident that your votes are secure, which Brian's going to have something to say about. But the CISA and FBI statement, it was a little more subdued. They came out and said where there may be some risk to election information housed on government networks, there may be some risk to that information housed on government networks. The point though, however, the FBI and CISA have no evidence to date that integrity of elections data has been compromised. There's a few different ways that you could look at that, but it does, I think, raise the important question of could the integrity of the vote actually be at risk? And for that, we want to turn to Brian Martin and take a much closer look at the security of our electronic voting machines themselves. Brian, take it away.
Hello, thank you. So we're going to have a brief discussion about electronic voting machines. And we'll start out with the fact that I've been working on vulnerability databases since around '93. But it wasn't until 2009 before I started diving into the research papers on EVMs that openly talk about those problems. Risk-based security has been covering EVMs since 2016, specifically pointing out the potential threats and the severity of the impact. During this journey, we've added 304 EVM vulnerabilities to the database, and of those, only 3 can be found in CVE and NVD, which is the U.S. government database tracking vulnerabilities. So they don't necessarily have the best view into what's going on. Let's start with the risk around EVMs and the common misconception and defense that EVMs are standalone systems with no connectivity to anything else. While that is true in some cases, and there are many EVMs that are not connected, instead they require vote tabulation using physical media like a cartridge or a USB drive. But even those have a more sinister threat we'll talk about later. Some of those machines, though, have been connected, not just on a local area network. Instead, some polling locations have connected these devices to the internet. Reading Kim Zetter's tweet above, you may think that 35 is not many, and you're right, 35 isn't. But an HBO documentary released earlier this year named Kill Chain, The Cyber War on America's Elections, they point out that AccuVote TSX machines, which are now owned by Dominion, will try to establish a local area connection on boot up, and those machines are being used in the current presidential election. We've also learned that some EVMs allow an administrator to install additional software on the device. In this case, one EVM vendor was pressured to admit that over 300 jurisdictions had installed PC Anywhere. That's software that allows full administrative access over a network. Even worse, there are 18 published vulnerabilities in PC Anywhere, one of which covers multiple unspecified vulnerabilities that have not been fixed. Even worse, I guess, the source code of that program was leaked back in 2012, and subsequent analysis says the code had, quote, undergone little change over the past decade.
Worser.
Yeah. Electronic voting machine vendors, and there are very few these days due to acquisitions, all seem to have the same mindset, that there are either no vulnerabilities, that they're theoretical, or they're impossible to exploit in real-world scenarios. Many will claim that their own experts do security reviews of these devices, yet they don't seem to fix any of the publicly disclosed vulnerabilities. So they don't publish security advisories, no change logs, and they don't make any security patches readily available on their websites. Because not caring about security isn't enough, a new electronic voting company called Votes, and that's with a Z, is attempting to influence legislation involving the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. They specifically oppose narrowing the CFAA to protect independent researchers, citing examples how they believe open research is harmful and a waste of tax dollars, even though it typically doesn't even use tax dollars. To me, restricting open security research on these critical infrastructure devices is working against the greater good, potentially making legitimate, helpful research illegal and put researchers at risk of prosecution and arrest. It's ridiculous. The bottom line is that most EVMs are vulnerable. In Virginia, the, quote, worst voting machines of all time were used for 12 years leading up to 2015 and were riddled with all sorts of problems, including users being able to connect to the machines using their cell phones. When confronted with these findings, Virginia officials basically ignored voters by saying the systems were safe due to strict security protocols and continued to use them for 7 more years. The strict security protocols they cited was actually in reference to the machine's Wi-Fi network password, which was ABCDE. So, follow along here, and hopefully I can get all this out without too many mistakes, because it's very convoluted. American Information Systems acquired the Election Services Division of Business Records Corporation and was later reincorporated as Election Systems and Software, or ES&S. They acquired the rights to Votronic and acquired Automark Technical Systems. Later, they acquired Premier Election Systems, formerly known as Diebold, but had to divest voting equipment systems from Premier due to an antitrust lawsuit. So they sold it to Dominion Voting Systems. Meanwhile, a different company long ago purchased the voting machine business of Automatic Voting Machine Corporation and reorganized as Sequoia Voting Systems. They obtained the Optech line of scanners from Business Record Corporations as part of that antitrust settlement I mentioned. But then they merged to ES&S, which sounds like it defeats the purpose of antitrust settlements. Either way, some machines from 2 of these companies are essentially the same device. And after Sequoia was acquired by Smartmatic, but only 2 years later had to sell Sequoia following a verdict by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. Okay, so you got all that? We know that these companies exist, but they keep kind of merging and divesting and remerging, but it's all eventually 1 or 2 companies. The real problem, though, is looking at one highly deployed EVM. We've aggregated 15 vulnerabilities in the Diebold AccuVote TS electronic voting machine, and they were disclosed in July of 2003. To the best of our knowledge, they remain unfixed 17 years later. The only solution, and that's using the word very loosely, is basically Band-Aid security. In our world, we call it the vulnerability whack-a-mole game. An issue is pointed out, and you kind of fix it just enough to limp along for a bit. The next issue comes up, rinse and repeat. So remember that epic Wi-Fi password of ABCDE? And kind of related to that, in the Kill Chain documentary, they revealed that the security pin for the TSX machine was 111. And when pointed out, the vendor had to remediate that issue, so they took the bold steps of changing it to 111, 111. So,
password security.
Is this really a concern? The TSX machines I mentioned are still in use for the 2020 elections. The AccuVote machines with 15 known vulnerabilities were used as recently as 2016 in Georgia and could be used in 2020. But in Georgia, that's where the Secretary of State had resisted calls to replace them, going further and rejecting the Department of Homeland Security's assistance in securing voting machines after the 2016 election. And we know they were likely used in the 2018 gubernatorial election, in which that same Secretary of State was actually a candidate. So personally, I'm a bit suspicious when someone wants to keep using vulnerable voting machines in an election they're running in. So the answer to, is it a concern, is a resounding yes. It absolutely is a concern. With EVM vendors still ignoring issues or pushing back against research on securing their systems, it does not bode well for the American citizen. Computer security experts are increasingly sounding the alarm, but it seems like no one is listening. So at this point, some of you still might be a little skeptical. Are these real threats? So let me tell you a horror story. Almost a decade ago, when I was initially digging into the long papers that outlined these voting machine vulnerabilities, I ran across several scenarios that really made me aware of the severity of this. And it was basically before remote attacks were even considered. The first outlined where a single Trojan USB stick could not only infect a vote tabulation computer, but infect every EVM connected to it. Another paper I read covered fraudulent firmware that can virally propagate from one ABC Advantage voting machine to another without the attacker being physically present. Once installed, it can steal votes in an election after election, not just one of them, but any election on that machine, and it can be done without any additional effort by the attacker via a single infected vote tallying cartridge. And such an attack could be carried out by a voter with a little luck or social engineering, or a volunteer poll worker who has legitimate access to the machines. So the attack scenarios go on and on about bugs that can be used to disenfranchise voters, unshuffle ballots to violate voter privacy, and multiple ways to manipulate votes, including attacks that don't even require knowing the candidate name. Instead, it just flips votes based on the party alone. One scenario outlined how as few as 3 people could flip not only a precinct, but an entire district and possibly a state.
Which is a really frightening proposition. And we do have a question from our audience about these voting machines.
Yes.
And yeah, so the question is the problem with the EMV vulnerabilities unique to the United States, or do you see similar machines and issues in use in other countries?
So for the most part, the electronic voting machine research that I'm reading is primarily coming out of the U.S. and out of academic circles. More recently, it has expanded to other people, partially because these machines are now fairly cheap to get on eBay. And one of the fun facts about that is not only do you get to buy them on eBay, they often come without being erased. So you're getting all the prior election data on them, right? But we do know that some vulnerabilities have been reported in the voting machines out of Brazil. But the company that makes them, which is on behalf of a government contract, is essentially owned by Diebold or one of the big manufacturers. So those machines are very much likely to be based on a lot of that old technology.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, there's only so many people that make these machines.
Right. So,
all right.
Is there a saving grace? As security folks, we might naturally assume that any tampering of votes could be determined via the audit logs. It's a good instinct, but no, there is no saving grace. In one report, it concluded that when polls closed, the results report printout is generated from the machine's internal memory. Therefore, all the so-called audit trails and results data agree with each other along with the printout, meaning that while tampering with the vote, you can just as easily tamper with the audit logs. Diebold's GEMS systems, the poll worker can simply delete the audit log without the ability to restore it, and that's by design. Hard intercivic EMS machines, you can manipulate the audit logs. Diebold Express Poll, the audit log can be used to violate voter privacy. The Diebold AccuVote optical scan, those audit logs can be manipulated as well. Hard intercivic servo machines, the audit log backup process has a heap buffer overflow that can lead to exploitation. Sequoia ADC Edge Audit Trail machine, the entire file system, including the bootloader, can be subverted. The Sequoia Hot system, internal audit logs are stored on removable media that can be manipulated. That same device, if you reset it, erases the audit log files completely, which any voter can do. And virtually none of these devices implement an audit log that has any cryptographic signature or protection. In short, if someone does tamper with an election at a technical level, we're basically guaranteed not to know. So, what does the future hold? How much of the material around vulnerabilities in EVMs was new to you in the past 20 minutes? If even a little bit of it was, we have to ask, why isn't all of this more well known? Why isn't the media covering these issues to inform voters and help pressure the vendors to fix vulnerabilities? There was some coverage in 2016, but we see almost none now, and that's likely due to the foreign interference and social manipulation that's going on. And that is something that is prevalent and easy to understand by most voters. But what if that social influence is actually one reason these foreign countries are making all that noise? What if it's to hide the fact that they are also manipulating elections at a technical level? Undermining our democracy is perhaps the most critical threat our country faces, and while some are aware of that, I'm not sure that many are seeing the bigger picture here. So, what can be done, especially at this point? We have to understand it's too late for this election. Over 58 million people have already voted in the U.S. presidential election, and that's up 160% from 2016 by the same time. For future elections, though, we as a community need to proactively provide resources for elections, starting locally. Your election commissioners, your local politicians, and anyone else involved in the process need to know the risks, including voters. We must advocate for a change in technology and force voting machine vendors to come up with or adopt new technology like Election Guard by Microsoft and the concept of star voting, which is a real neat, I want to say, shift in how we would vote in general. There's an entire website dedicated to that, which is, like I said, it's fascinating reading. So certainly there's no easy solution here, but starting with more knowledge around the risk with the severity of the impact is a good start.
That is some fun stuff.
Yeah. That's the end of the quick discussion on electronic voting machines, and I'll hand it back to Inga to see if we have any questions.
Yeah, we do have a few questions. One that actually I'm really curious to ask is you mentioned the star voting system and that it looks like a really promising change. I'm not familiar with that. Can you describe a little bit more what that is?
Yeah, so like I said, there's not only a website, there's actually a pretty fascinating article that was in Wired magazine, and I believe it's online as well, 1 or 2 months back. And it's a bigger article, but it goes into some details. But the idea of star voting is that we move away from a binary yes, no, yes for this candidate, no for that. Instead, it moves to basically a 5-point scale. So for one candidate, you may think, well, I'm not quite a 5 on them, I'm a 4. On this candidate, they're not totally foreign to me. I believe in a little bit of their policy, so I vote a 2 out of 5 on the scale. And using that, they would aggregate the numbers in a different way to come up with and basically kind of restructure the election. And that could be used very heavily, especially in the primaries, to not only indicate which of these candidates I think are stronger, in that simple binary way, but then that could also be used by the candidates to say, well, you know, maybe I need to clarify my position on this or that. So again, it's a pretty radical shift from the way we have traditionally done it, but it does hold a lot of promise, and it can be implemented in a way that is not really any different to us than a random survey we take online.
Wow, that's pretty cool. That's really cool. I imagine there's probably some bugs in that system too yet to be worked out.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Well, following on the international question, we do have another question, and that is there any information out there about how far and wide these vulnerable machines are spread? Like, do we know how many are actually out there in the field?
So the vendors, which is to probably no one's surprise, don't publish that kind of information. The good part is that the locality, if you go to your local government, that is something that if you request that information, they should be able to provide. So it's like a journalist or even as a citizen advocate, if you do what is the equivalent of a Freedom of Information Act request at a local level and say, how many of these machines or what machines are you using, when were they deployed, those are the questions that should be readily available. I know that there are some initiatives that are trying to tally this information. We're starting to see this come up in more and more articles about the election. We saw it very heavily around the Georgia primaries and election in 2016, and I think in 2018 as well, because these machines are starting to become part of the discussion. Like I mentioned, having someone that is advocating for using insecure machines who turns around and runs in an election using them, that's suspicious. So it's really great to see journalists start to bring that up as part of the dialogue.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, another question that comes to my mind in particular is, you know, we have such a segmented election system, you know, with each county, each locality being responsible for running the election through their own system. What do you see as the likelihood of being able to replicate an exploit across those multiple jurisdictions?
Because the machines are pretty varied, not only between the couple of vendors that we have, but because they come from prior companies and some of them have been in use for as long as 15 years, there's no single exploit that could just be used across all the jurisdictions or many of them, right? But instead, the more sinister threat that I alluded to is that it doesn't require too many jurisdictions. So in the US, we have our swing states, which seem to get all the attention. And if you can influence even a district or a couple precincts in a swing state at the right time, you could potentially alter the entire state's outcome. So it's a little less about, does an attacker have to do this to 50 different jurisdictions? No, they don't. They could potentially effectively do it with, say, 5 or maybe even less. We also know that some of these elections are being decided with a difference as few as 10 and 20,000 votes. So if you're going to tamper with the votes and you're going to do it across a few precincts, you're really able to do it at such a small degree that it doesn't seem abnormal. If someone does go behind that and say, well, wait a minute, let's go check these results, well, as I pointed out, you don't really have the audit logs that you need. So instead, you just kind of retabulate the votes, and it's like, well, you know, this precinct was 5,000 higher than last time. You know, maybe that's a legitimate shift in ideology where people are saying, I am tired of this candidate, I'm ready for this one, or vice versa. So the real threat is that it needs to be looked at a very local level, with the understanding that even at that local level, it can basically roll uphill and have a much bigger impact nationally.
Yeah, it's a scary thought, and you know, potential even for hackers just out there talking about it, saying that they did it, even if they didn't. Again, just to create that mistrust or create that uncertainty or doubt about the outcome of the election. So hard to have hard information in that particular respect. We have one more question for you, Roy. We've talked about some of that state-sponsored activity going on. We know that the usual culprits are always being pointed at with Russia, China, some of the other folks that we love to blame for malicious activity. Are you seeing evidence of other countries or other state-sponsored actors trying to influence or get in on the act of influencing the U.S. election, at least that we know about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the American elections are an interest probably to virtually every country in the world, I'll say. So every country has a reason to kind of be involved and kind of, you know, have a say in it or try to sway it. So we kind of do see a lot of these other countries try to get involved in different ways. I think there was just recently a report that we saw Colombia try to partake in hacktivism, try to partake in obtaining American voter data. So it's kind of interesting to see. Traditionally, you'd see a lot of people interested in American elections but not be able to do anything. And then now it seems to be that hacktivism and our reliance on the internet and technology kind of lowered the barrier for hacktivists or for countries to be able to influence.
Get in there. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. All right. Well, with that, I think we have answered our questions for today. I do have a reminder for our audience. Our next webinar will be on November 10th, where we will be talking about our data breach research and the data breach trends that we've seen through the first 3 quarters of this year. Following that, we'll be doing a vulnerability webinar as well. So again, please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out on all that insight into that research. And with that, I do want to thank everybody for tuning in, listening to the session. We were really excited to share our research with you, and we're so glad that you could spend the time with us. Thank you very much for listening in, and we'll see you next time.